så jag har lagt in bara bilderna här efter, så det är bara att bläddra fram. Men det finns ingen sån här bläddergrej.
Vilken bläddrar man med då? Den.
Bara så. Så ska det vara. Okej.
Den och så bakåt om du vill gå bakåt?
Då är det bläddra fram med den och bak med den.
Okej.
Mm.
Ja, men det är bra.
Ja.
Det ska nog klara.
Viktigt att prata in i micken. Hallå? Ja, nu är den på. Ja.
Bara när man snackar.
Ja, nej, man kan ju stänga av dem. Det kan ju höras annars om man blåser. Att det går in liksom. Man får vara lite, det är ju inte helt lätt.
Men det är...
Nu är den på så att säga. Där, så att...
Är det bara 2 lägen? Ja, det är det. Ja, det är bra. Jag har, vet du vad jag har ägnat mig åt de sista månaderna? Jag har gjort en brandgata ute på vår ö. Jag har tagit ner hur många träd som helst.
Det är ju roligt. Visst är det? Jag älskar det så.
Ja, precis. Så att,
various kinds of studies. Many of them are evaluations. We have commissioned a couple of country evaluations where the focus is on one particular country in development cooperation. So we have had studies of development cooperation in Uganda and in Tanzania. We have this one with Bosnia-Herzegovina that we will talk about today, and there's another one on development cooperation in Cambodia forthcoming, and we will launch another one on Ethiopia. But we also do other kinds of studies, synthesis studies of aid to the education sector, for example, and to in climate development cooperation, and many other types of studies. Normally, those who do the studies are researchers, consultants, and we work on this principle that we call double independence, meaning that we in the committee are independent of the government. That is, we commission and take initiatives to the kinds of studies that we think are of interest and potential use in the decision-making processes around development cooperation. But then our authors are also independent of us, thereby the double independence. Most of our reports are published, and there are seminars like this when they are ready. Often we take them to the cooperating countries, like when the Tanzania study was ready, we presented it in Dar es Salaam as well. So we put quite a heavy emphasis on communication of results. We have a podcast that you can follow where there are shorter discussions, comments on issues in development cooperation. Now, today we will talk about this report on the case of inclusive development in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The afternoon will be organized as follows. The author, Claes Lindahl, will introduce the report, and he has roughly half an hour for that. Then we have 3 persons who will comment on the report with something like 10 minutes each. And we have Torgny Svenningsson from SIDA, who is head of the unit Western Balkan, Turkey, and Latin America. Necessary for me to look at that list of names of countries, so I can see the logic of it. And then Henrik Riebe will also comment on the report, and he is working with the Regional Department for Eastern Partnerships, Western Balkan, and Latin America. And then Sara Johansson da Silva will also comment, and Sara is a member of the committee, and she was also present on the reference group. Each of our studies has a reference group that follow the work and provide as much quality inputs to the quality of report as we possibly can, and I chaired this particular study, and Sara was also a member of that reference group. So that's the first half hour is with Claes. The second half hour is with commenters, and then the next half hour, the third one, will be for all of you to put questions, comment on the report, discuss it as much as we can. And we aim to be ready by around 3:45, and then you're invited to join us here for coffee, tea, and to talk a little bit more about the report afterwards. So Claes, you're welcome to present the report. It's a pleasure to have you here and to have been working with you for the past, is it a year and a half or so? Well, working with you is perhaps saying it too much. It's you who have done the work, and we have been around. So, yeah. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? No one can hear me. Well, I will just see that I make the right thing here. Yes. Well, I must start to say it was a pleasure to undertake this study and evaluation for me. First, it was a great team, and one of the team members is Mikael Söderbeck, who I worked with. He's an old SIDA man, and I worked with him for quite a number of years, and always, from my point of view, with good results. Another team member is my wife, Julie. Unfortunately, she cannot participate today. She is, parallel to this, been publishing a book on fascism development, or the fascism from in the German time, the Nazi time, which turned out to be a bestseller, so she's constantly in demand. She regrets she cannot be here. And finally, but not last, Tamara Ivankovic, our Bosnian partner, Sarajevo, and she represents the good thing, the best thing of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Smart woman, always joyful, always optimistic in spite of difficult circumstances. Without her, we would not have been able to do that. She's translate perfectly, constantly. Anyway, so that was a start. Now let me push the right one. I'm not going to go through the history of Bosnia-Herzegovina over the last 500 years. It's part of the report. And why? Because we believe that history is critical for development, it's critical for the future, it's critical for aid. What can be done, what cannot be done, what are the issues? And Bosnia-Herzegovina certainly has a traumatic history back from the 400 years under Ottoman rule, during the Yugoslav time and Tito's unique economic policy, and unfortunately, the bottom line, the war. These are partly war criminals, partly they're all presidents, and it's the Dayton Agreement, 1995, which ended the war successfully, and which really laid the groundwork for Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the sense of it created a peace, and a lasting peace, so far lasting peace. It was in a way a peak of good international cooperation at a time when no one objected. It's not like these days when there's someone objecting to a peace like in Syria or Middle East. At this time, everyone came together and sorted out a very nasty war. It paved the way for massive reconstruction, and it also added the High Representative that was basically, in a way, ruling Bosnia and Herzegovina for the first 5-10 years, and was critical to create a united country. Without him, I think they were all him, they're still in place, but much less power now. There were no female in that one. It also created, unfortunately, in a way, the result what the warlords wanted, an ethnically divided country. In two entities, Republika Srpska with the Bosnian Serbs, the Federation for the Muslims, the Bosnians as they call them, and the Croats. And that one is divided in 10 cantons, divided with some with Croats, some with Muslims, and a few mixed. And then you have also in the north a small entity added later, Britko, which is a mixed one. And each of these 10 plus 2 entities plus 1 entity has their own government, their own ministries, and are basically autonomous. And as you can imagine, it is in a way, unmanageable country. It is so complex, so difficult to undertake reforms, so much antagonistic development. And this is the context aid has to work in, if you excuse me. Well, he is expressing this, Dudik, the strongman of Serbia. Now he's the president, one of the 3 presidents of the country, and he's the chairman of that one. So he's basically the leader of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and he makes no secret that he wants Republika Srpska to break out of Bosnia-Herzegovina for independence or join the Serbs. And this was a nice comment he made a couple of years ago. Aid, 15 billion from 1995 until, I only have figures for 2016, but it's about 16 billion today. Sweden is the 7th largest donor for the whole period. And if you only look at the last 10 years or 8 years, it is the 4th largest. So it's today dominating, not dominating in money, but dominating as one of the actors. And as you can see, the EU is totally dominating in financial terms. Well, now that was the start, that was the context. Now we'll talk a bit of the specific evaluation. And as I said before, the contextual analysis is to us very essential. The focus on the evaluation was on a portfolio of projects in economic development, defined basically as industry, agriculture, business environment, trade, etc., the OECD DAC criteria. And those 50 projects is about 1 billion in Swedish crowns in aid, which is a quarter to a third, or somewhat about a quarter and a third of the total allocation by Sweden to Bosnia-Herzegovina over the period. So it's a substantial part, but it's not the full part. And what we tried to do was to define what was the background to these projects, the justification, and the results, not least the results, as expressed in evaluations, in reviews, and by people we met as a complement. But of course, we could only touch lightly on 50 projects. The report spends a lot of time to try to describe the process, how these projects came about, and the results, etc. And we made an assessment of what we call value for money, which is a concept that DFID, the British DFID, used to a large extent. I don't think SIDA has ever used it, but it's in a way a combination of the common OECD DAC criteria of relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, sustainability, and impact. And we tried to see to what extent have these projects contributed to sector development and to the strategic objectives by Sweden as expressed in the various country strategies which have been on since year 2000, and the current one is ongoing to 2020. I'm sure some of you will have a lot of questions of methodology. Anyway, this is the portfolio. We divided it in 5 clusters to make it more comprehensible. And the clusters were agriculture or agriculture related. It was finance, business environment reform. It was other forms of SME development, and in the center, regional economic development. And I'm not going to go through all the projects in these circles, then we will spend another half or more hour on that. But what you can see, or what I can say is that it's a very diverse, creative, in many ways, portfolio. At some of it at the company level, the micro level, some at the macro level, in policies, institutions. SIDA has been very creative, very dynamic in putting this portfolio together over a 23-year or 24-year period. If you look at how it's distributed financially, agriculture constitutes 60% more or less of that 1 billion. And I will come back to the question, why is it that so much is dominated by agriculture? The other 4 sectors or themes share more or less equal parts the balance. In our assessment of results or the value for money at the project level, we defined that maybe 20% of the allocation could be said to have good value for money, good results. It was a bank privatization project in the very early stage, which was successful, but Sweden was just a small part of a World Bank, USAID, Dutch, etc., project that created a viable bank system out of a not viable bank system, state-owned enterprises. Business environment reform, in terms of the start of business, all the criteria that the World Bank and IFC has worked well, and has worked well because it was a cooperation with the World Bank and IFC. But not that well, because Bosnia and Herzegovina it's the lowest ranked of the Balkan countries, have reformed less than the other countries. Credo is maybe the star among all the projects. It was a regional development project based on this triple helix model, where you get SMEs, authorities, municipalities to work together, based on an EU concept which tried to break through the entities, to include entities under one region, basically to avoid the ethnic division. And it was implemented by local organizations, not international consultants, not international organizations. And it worked well. It was considered by everyone we talked to and by reports we read as a star project. And it was going on for quite some time in 3 starts. Start Bosnia was a small project along the lines of Start East, and it had a couple of successes, and one very great success that eventually led to thousands of jobs, directly or indirectly. Poor value, mostly of the agriculture support. And I will talk a little bit of that. Agriculture started off under the Integrated Area Program, which was a project in the early part. House reconstruction to help people, refugees, to return home, but it also included agriculture to give people a chance to survive. And that was definitely justified and worked well, but it was carried on even when the economy was working, and it was carrying on for much too long time, until a couple of nasty reviews said this is useless, it's spending more money than they produce for, it's not sustainable, they are not farmers, they are not, etc., etc. So that was the origin, but it continued. Agriculture continued after SIDA had exited these agriculture projects. And some of those worked somewhat well, but some failed. And the question is, why agriculture in Bosnia-Herzegovina? It's not an agriculture country. It doesn't have a strength in agriculture, given its geography and location. And during the Yugoslav time, it was a neglected sector. It was treated at that time, Bosnia was an industrialized country. Some are mixed. Microfinance is a success in the sense that it created one of the best microfinance institutions, but it was done with a lot of market distortions, a lot of subsidies of a well-functioning commercial operation. I think I've hinted to the reasons here. It worked well with cooperation with the World Bank. The World Bank is a good partner in bank privatization and business reform. SIDA took risks in doing the Credo, and I think that is one of the strengths of SIDA. SIDA is ready to take risks that others are not. Sometimes it works, sometimes not. In Credo, it worked. Trusted local partners. I mentioned Start Bosnia, and I'll go back. And the poor results, the dominance of agriculture, I mentioned. The dysfunctional governance structure of the country impacted on almost everything. And there was a problems to shift from humanitarian assistance to development cooperation. These are the objectives that strategies have expressed. that are relevant or partly relevant for economic development or for the portfolio we are dealing with. I should just stress that. This is not the performance of SIDA as such, it's of the portfolio of 50 projects. And at the bottom line are the higher level, which is very difficult to say anything about. And I will come back to that. SME development, yes, SIDA did very well on that. Market transformation, yes, it is a market economy and SIDA's contributed. Employment, not well at all. And this is because of so much went into agriculture, and agriculture in Bosnia is not an absorber of jobs. If one wants to improve the agriculture, one has to lay off people rather, so it's a reducer of. I don't know where for time, but I'll go on this one. Now, this is not a quantifiable thing. It's not, we haven't worked out some kind of things there, but it's the indication of how we perceive the value or the use of aid to Bosnia. Of course, during the war, the humanitarian system, which we haven't looked at, was justified, highly justified. The reconstruction was very successful. It was the country was reconstructed from destruction, and institutions were built, market transformation took place, and SIDA was one of the actors in that one. It was highly valuable. But there has been a decline since, and 2007 is a bit of a watershed in the sense that the constitution which Dayton had created, one tried to change this one, but it failed. And after that, I think the hope for the country was lost by many people. And if you look at the small picture next to it, 2007, foreign direct investments, until then it worked up, increased constantly, and it dropped dramatically 2007 to 2008. Partly because of the financial crisis, the global financial crisis. But you compare it to Albania, they had the same, but in Bosnia-Herzegovina, it hasn't picked up. I think that is a mood of the country, unfortunately, and aid is not solving that problem. The country doesn't need money anymore. The country doesn't need technical assistance anymore. It is all a question of politics and reform by politicians. A couple of lessons or issues that can be worthwhile to discuss is when you do these long-term evaluations, it's not only a problem from a methodological point of view, but it's also a question of information. It is very difficult to get access to historical data in SIDA, in spite of high degree of transparency in archive, but it's just too cumbersome. Then if you are basing it all on reviews and evaluations, they tend to be, in a way, very narrow in the sense that they are treated in isolation. They are not trying to draw the conclusions to the broader objectives. They are dealing with measurements like quantifications of rather specific objectives. Fine in itself, but it doesn't help if you want to see the big picture. We call it aid as a political project and a technocratic project. It started off as a political project with clear ideas, but it has become a technocratic in the sense that we continue business as usual, almost whatever happens in the country, because there is an institution, there are systems, etc. Exit is a problem because of that. Exit from sectors like agriculture, and there is the problem of a sunk cost syndrome. We have spent a lot of money in a sector, in agriculture in this case. It didn't work out too well, but if we stop, if we don't continue, we lose that money. It's a false thinking, but it's a common thinking. So there's kind of a path dependency or continuation. And how do you deal with bad politics? Normally you see aid should help governments to implement what they do, but I would say that is not the case in Bosnia, because some politicians in a way want something totally different from what the international community wants. The cooperation with USAID was a lot of that in Bosnia-Herzegovina in this sector. And there are problems with that one, in the sense that USAID is, in a way, a traditional donor. Large project implemented by a large consultancy group, all American, designed by those, and it works out sometimes, and wow, a lot of time. And so you will save time here. Some of these USAID projects were okay. I think the guarantee projects, which is one thing, has been good. SIDA has learned something, there's been good cooperation. But in agriculture, USAID started off working with a few sectors or subsectors, and SIDA joined them, and large projects in the same subsectors, and a second phase of that, called pharma, was continued with substantial budgets in the same sectors. And the part of GDP of agriculture has, over the time, declined. I don't have the figures for employment, but supposedly it hasn't grown. So it is a certain type of path dependency which has not worked well. They worked with industries in a project called Firma, or the same approach, but I think with better results. But there have been contradictory evaluations. One Swedish evaluation said excellent, an American one said no impact. We cannot judge that one, but only two. I think, well, SIDA's administrative capacity. When you think of, and this, I think I generalize now far beyond, because I worked long in this business. Development is a very complex business. There's a lot of learning, it's a lot of trial and error, it's need a lot of analysis. And aid budgets are very large, and etc. The management of that is left to fairly few people, and people that move around a lot. And this is a kind of imbalance of resources which I don't understand. And that's been going on. I think it's such a waste. There should be more people, more time to do analysis, and to be able to do smaller projects and not just go for big projects that absorb a lot of money to get rid of the money. And the role of the EU. Well, the last one. Our conclusions from this evaluation is that should really SIDA, donors, the international community, continue to pour money into a country really that do a lot of stuff to obstruct the reform process with different objectives? I think there are two basic reasons. One is that the risk of a new war, which is not impossible. And the other one is part of Europe. And it's part of Europe where you have a lot of confrontations currently with the EU, Russia, Turkey, China, a lot of interest in this area. And I know EU doesn't have a very good record as a development cooperation organization, but EU is the only organization that can put enough power behind reforms, if they really do so, if they really did. And I wish or we wish that SIDA would line up with that fully, 100%, and towards reform and focus on getting, but I am finished. So we save 5 minutes for interesting comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for a very clear, concise presentation of the evaluation report. We'll have plenty of time to discuss it the last half hour here, so we'll proceed with the other presentations, discussions, comments here. Klaus, you did this presentation in half an hour, very, very clear. It is such a complex report, and it's more like a book than a traditional evaluation. But in the discussions we have had about it, I've heard people refer to it as a page turner. So one shouldn't really be afraid of the length of the report. It's easy reading, complex stuff, but very interesting. Thanks for that. Well, welcome, Torgny Svenningsson. You take the floor here, and I introduced you before. Many of you probably know Torgny, but with a background from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and SIDA, and when we met outside here, we discovered that we probably met 30 years ago as well, which goes to show how long you have been around. And me too, by the way.
Yeah.
So,
I guess it shows, but yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here, for being here this day, those of you who are listening or maybe even watching. And also a special thanks to Klaus and his team. I must say that from SIDA, we are very grateful for this type of studies and evaluations. So they really give us quality information that we need. It is a good report. It has a lot of information, very valuable for us. And we also, as you mentioned, we do appreciate this very long view. It's not often that we do that in development cooperation, but having this long view gives a lot of other insights, I would say. It is also concretely useful for us in our work to plan for future possible development cooperation, depending on what is decided on the political level. But we constantly work on the mission we have at present. So that's what we do, and that's why we think this is very important to have. So there are many recommendations, many lessons learned, and I will come back to a couple of them, and then also my colleague Henrik Riby will build further on that. Right, I would just to start off like to make a couple of very short sort of additions, or I don't know if they are clarifications, but I think they're important for this whole matter. As I guess you know, we do have a strategy decided by our government. The strategy is a 7-year strategy, and it encompasses 10 countries, including a regional program. So by necessity, it is not very detailed. It is not a document that gives us. There is in the report a chapter about the sort of having a better quality strategy. So that's why I mentioned this. So it is a very wide, and it gives a lot of course, freedom to see that to plan and implement according to that strategy, which we think is good because we think it needs to be adapted to context and developments. It also doesn't have a very explicit, it's not explicit on the poverty reduction goal. This is, however, something that we have in our overall governance, governing documents. So within this frame of preparing the countries in Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans, including Turkey, for EU accession, we work with the poorest groups, with creating possibilities for poor men and women or persons living in poverty. So I just wanted to make those clarifications. Can you hear me well? Yeah? Right. Thank you. Continuing then, as to, I think especially what you were writing and what you mentioned here, Klaus, as to the way forward and those lessons learned that you point to. First of all, I want to say that we do agree on of course, everyone agrees on the very complex governance structure of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and what that implies for any long-term development and political will and political change needed for that development. while that is true, I would like to say on an overall note that we do see this report also confirming the very important contribution made by Swedish Development Corporation, together with other funders and other actors. I think we can, from the report, see that we have made a difference. We have made a difference in healing a very wounded and fractured country, creating some kind of normality, although unfortunately confirming the ethnic division. So that's one. Then on the issue of agriculture and the focus and the excessive focus on agriculture, I think there can be, it is clear that there has been a very strong focus, and I think you partly give the answer to why, because it has been done within a context of people returning and a humanitarian context, where you did have to find possibilities for people to actually do something where they happen to be living. That is something we have done, and it is something that we are working on, and we have been working on to sort of change over time. But yes, it is true. I can confirm, but it is also based on this humanitarian context and needs. I think when it comes to path dependence, this is, I think, one lesson that we have learned from in many places is, of course, if there is something that you should be continuing, yes, you should continue for a longer time. You should persist. Of course, you should also have the wisdom to end something that isn't paying off and isn't giving the value for money. I think we can also see from the report that we are doing that. We are changing. We are introducing elements of working with sectors that have a stronger and higher potential for growth, economic growth, and also for job creation. So I think I presume my colleague Henrik will come back to that a bit. Your final note was about the future and let EU take the lead, basically, leave it up to the EU. Yes, that's a good idea, I think. I think our experience of working in the Western Balkans in general is that what we do is actually to coordinate very tightly with the European Union Development Assistance, with the Instrument for Pre-Accession Assistance, EPA. The EC is our most like-minded partner, that's for sure. And we look for division of labor. We look for complementarity, where we can do things that Commission is not so good at doing, and also where we can leverage bigger resources. We can prepare, in this case Bosnia, to make better use of EU funding and other finances funding. And I would say the EC is not always so proactive and forthcoming in that. So it's sort of, we have to do this influence on many levels. I'm not sort of shying away from our responsibility. We should continue doing that and do it more, I think. But it is a bit complicated in that sense. Imbalance of resources and CEDA's administrative capacity. Thank you for making that note. Of course, we are extremely happy about that. And we would love to be able to be this sort of creative and risk-taking hub with a lot of resources for analysis and implementation and follow-up. That's not the way it is at present, and we will have to make do with what our governors instruct. So it's a larger issue beyond Bosnia. Finally, there were many comments, but I will just mention a couple here about this. We should improve the way we document, making it easier for people like you, Claes, and Mikael to actually evaluate. That is important. And to have this institutional memory. We are trying to amend that to make it a bit better, but we are definitely not perfect, and we can do a lot more. Make exit explicit. I think that is something we are doing increasingly. So I just agree on that. And I think my time is actually has come to a stop. So thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Take note of many of the things. We'll get an opportunity to come back to them. I'm personally particularly curious about the way you find a report with a long-term perspective like this useful, but we'll return to that later. So, Henrik, we look forward to hearing your comments on the report, and Henrik's background is in those particular sectors that have been successful here.
Yeah, definitely.
So it will be easy for you to comment on it.
Thank you very much, Kim. First of all, I will put my timer on so I don't get lost in time. Thank you, Claes, Mikael, Tamara, and Julian, for a great report. It's been a pleasure to read this one. And it's always, well, we have read reports from you earlier, but this one is outstanding, I see, not only because of the sheer size of it, but the way how it's written and the level of analysis. I enjoyed every one of the 200 pages, except the last bits of the, what do you call when you have references and stuff? Yeah, that one. No, but it's a great report, very nice. And especially when you have 23, 24 years of development in one report, because normally we see them 2 years, or one project, or one program, one sector. That's different ballgame. This is very valuable, and it's really good for our learning, and we will hopefully also share it with other colleagues in Bosnia, other donors, and can take part of this one. And thanks to EBA for arranging this seminar. It's great, because we can interchange and learn from each other. Now, I just have a couple of comments. Claes, you described the situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I mean, you have extremely high corruption, you have low labor participation, you have outward migration, a huge public sector, an extremely small private sector, informality, one of the lowest productivity levels we've seen in the region, dysfunctional governance, regulation, and in this context, we are supposed to create wealth and make people more happy and rich. It's not the easiest one, but we will have to do it, of course. And we do the same. We try to do the same in Somalia and Sudan and DRC. So that's not it's a problem per se, but we have to deal with it. Now, I think the report is very good because you put the spotlight on some critical issues and where you can take one decision in one way or another one. For example, striking the balance between going agriculture rural or to look at the new sectors where you might have huge growth in the future. And Torgny explained that also, and you too, with the reason why we went rural in the first place, because it was more like humanitarian assistance. Then, did we exit in time? Well, maybe not. But we still have, apart from the strategy goals, we have the poverty goal. So we will always be inclined to work as close as possible to the poorest groups in society. But I think as we see that the program we have developing, the current market development initiatives we have are doing more looking at the future sectors, looking at where we can attract youth, where they can find some hope and find hopefully employment and income, of course. We do take a lot of risks. We have the challenge funds, the challenge fund number 2, which was introduced by Pelle Persson in those days. And it was extremely high risk decision in those days, but it seemed that it turned out very well. We went into the hub 387, like I did ICT hub. We were rather criticized for doing that by many colleagues. But after some time, it shows that you have to take risks if you will find the new ways out of this lack of development. Still, Bosnia's statistics on all economic development is not shining today either. So we have to be there, stay in for some time. You also put the finger on an interesting thing is when we work with the USAID, and if you compare the staff resources thank you for that, if we would have the same staff resources per money paid out, we will be 3 times more, at least, at SIDA, and we're not. So when we get into big projects with the USAID, we have to fight with that they always, we tend to end up in the back seat. And you see less of those programs today, I have to say. We've been there, and you have to stay very on top of everything if you will keep the pace they are doing. And we also have a different thing, as you point out, that you can call it old school development. SIDA is inclining more towards the market system development approach, which takes longer, but you will get the results in a much more sustainable way. And that you might not do that with USAID, but with other donors too. Okay, about the proposals, the EU lead Torgny commented on that one. It's not easy, but we have to try, keep on trying. We have to look for new partners all the time. World Bank, of course, is normally a very good partner in specific areas like business reform and that. But we also have to find the local partners, the locally based partners, because they will be there even when the donors are gone. See how much can we work with them. And it doesn't have to be government all the time. We work with private sector a lot now. We work with regional development councils, local councils, and we see that can make more sustainable change in the long run. Another interesting thing is the market distortion discussion. Of course, it's very pertinent comment because we need to be on our toes when it comes to market distortion. We don't have to go in too big, too fast. We will probably make a lot of cause negative effects. But if we do it right, we are distorting a market that is not working, and then it's called market development, because most markets are not working very well, especially for the poorer groups in society. So it's a very difficult balance to strike, but we need to develop and distort those markets that are not well functioning. Now, that's also market systems development approach, to look how to change that in a sustainable way and not just go like a tank and remove everything by force. Now, just to see, you had a very interesting slide on the value for money, which is an interesting concept, and we hear it when we work with DFID a lot, and maybe we should have a look at it at SIDA. I think that we had that in the bank privatization, which is good, but you can just do it once and then they are privatized. But we did it, and we should be proud of that. The business environment, as you said, it was a good value, but then business environment is still one of the worst in the region. And so how successful were we in that sense? Because it all comes down to political economy at the end of the day anyway. The poor value, most agri projects, you say, well, yeah, probably, but we have other reasons, we had other reasons at least to be there. We don't have those reasons today, so we're not there anymore, or much more. We're phasing out most of that stuff. And then you have the unclear ones, the innovation support, and I think we can have this chat in a couple of years, and we will hopefully look back and say, those high-risk decisions you took 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, some of them failed badly, but some of them were great successes. And you didn't pick a couple of winners, but we started a race within a couple of sectors that really changed the economy in the long run, like the ICT sector. That's what I do hope. So, okay, my time is out, so let's talk more later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for a couple of good themes to come back to later as well about risk-taking.
Now you're done.
About risk-taking. And so Sara, welcome up here, and it's a pleasure to see you. Sara is also, as I mentioned, on the expert committee and has has also a PhD from the Stockholm School of Economics, and you have been with the World Bank as a staff
Yes.
member as well, which
Yes.
is mentioned a few times,
Right,
the bank, so
right.
maybe you'll come back to that. We'll see.
Thank you. No, I'm not, unfortunately, maybe responsible for anything that the World Bank has done in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I can't brag about that. I was going to brag a little bit, though, because I feel that the previous speakers, and thank you very much for both to Claes for the presentation and for the full report and for the comments, have covered a lot of the specific Bosnia-Herzegovina issues, and I wanted to maybe take the opportunity instead to point to some questions that this report raises for me in terms of the more general issues that we face in development assistance. And the bragging part is because I'm going to take the opportunity to make a little bit of publicity also for some of the reports that the EBA is doing in other areas and countries. And the first thing I wanted to say is, and this is perhaps bragging again then on part of EBA, is that I think this is a very useful report. Maybe it's not up to me to say it's useful, maybe it's up to Henrik and Torgny to say that, but at least it's a very interesting report for anyone in the development business. This long-term perspective really gives you the opportunity to see how strategies develop over time and how those connect to economic and political development in a country, which if you just focus on a country level strategy for a couple of years, you don't get that picture. And I think this is one of the great strengths of these kind of country studies, and first publicity. As Kim was saying, we are doing these kind of studies in other countries. The interesting thing with Bosnia-Herzegovina is that it's the only transition country so far. It's an upper middle income country. The other countries are Cambodia, Uganda, and Tanzania. So the issues are different, the aid modalities are different, labor markets look different, poverty profiles are different. So there's a lot of learning from this specific report also in that context. And I think what I particularly like, one of the things that I particularly like about Claes and his team's report is the way that they are also specifying, you know, where are the different issues, problems, or values emerging? Is it in the definition of what are the development challenges? Is it the way the strategy reflects those development challenges? Is it the way the projects reflect the strategy or not? Or is it in the implementation of the project or something else which is beyond the control of SIDA and the Foreign Ministry? So I think this is one of the main points. The second point I wanted to make, and you've touched on it, the two previous speakers as well, I think, is this sort of eternal catch-22 of development assistance, namely that the countries with the most dysfunctional governance structures, near failed states, are also the ones where most help usually are needed. And so if we look forward, this trend will also increase. There's indication that the poverty and the poor will actually keep concentrating in post-conflict or conflict countries, where we know that these kind of ruptures and dysfunctional governance structures are endemic. So how do you work effectively in those settings? And some other studies that we have looked, so the Uganda study is showing that, for example, they are working more with civil society over time. In Turkey, this is also the case. In Bosnia, Claes is showing that they have worked very successfully at the local government level, bringing in, so when the central government level did not work, the local government level has been a fairly effective partner for the region economic development programs. So that's another way of getting into the structures and working in the countries when the top is not working. It does raise questions, of course, about the sustainability of those programs and about ownership, which is one of those main principles of the aid effectiveness agenda, of course. So how do you actually continue working in these countries over the long time if the central government does not buy in to what you're doing, really? And I think this is one of the open questions regarding Bosnia. And the third point that I wanted to make is really this the importance of doing a detailed and good diagnostics and developing a theory of change, a way how you see that your project, your strategy will meet these challenges based on your diagnostics. And this goes back to the connecting the strategy to the challenges and connecting your projects to the strategy. So if you're in a country, and typically this is in the post-conflict country, this is very important, you're trying to foster social and economic inclusion, and you're trying to foster cohesion, right? So where do you start? And this is questions that you also talked about. Do you start where the vulnerable are? Trying to promote agriculture, trying to promote low-skilled jobs, working in the rural areas, trying to make sure women, disadvantaged groups get in. So this is one approach you might take. Another approach you might take is say, okay, we're working with SMEs, but we're looking for high-growth entrepreneurs, like the Start Bosnia program, who can then give a lot of job to other people. We're looking for high-growth sectors. We're working with a business environment. We are looking at the end that we get the economy growing, and then we're hoping that this will trickle down to the poor, or we're trying to look for ways of helping poor and vulnerable groups accessing this growth, so it becomes more inclusive, or we're counting on the tax system to sort of help trickle down through a social welfare system. I think that's still very optimistic in the case of Bosnia, but it's one way, no, to go. And so I think the report does a very, very good job of explaining why agriculture and to some extent the microfinance interventions were not such a good approach. But I don't think there's a generic conclusion as to which way you should go, and probably you should do a bit of both. And so again, this goes back to the importance of doing diagnostics, understanding those diagnostics and applying them to a strategy, and making sure that strategy then has projects that reflect what you really want to do. And this comes back to a point that all three previous speakers also have raised, which is that to spend money well, you really need to spend more money. And actually, we have an ongoing report looking a little bit at this issue of administrative cost versus, overheads and how that affects the effectiveness of aid. I think it's really important to consider. It needs a lot of marketing, because it's not easy to sell as a concept. It will cost a lot to give money, because we want to do high-risk projects which can fail, and so there's a high cost. Projects which need a lot of preparation. We want to do good diagnostics. We want to do good evaluations. Klaus is recommending control group evaluations. That costs even more. So this is, of course, another issue to think about when we are looking at how we actually allocate the budgets for different projects and what is needed in terms of actually implementing them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The way we have designed it was that after these three commenters on the report, there would be criticism for Klaus to respond to. Now, I don't find that such a heavy barrage of criticism on the report, so you don't have to be particularly defensive. But there are, of course, issues that you may want to comment on a little bit further and reflect on, because of what you presented here is, of course, only a small part of what's in the report. So we'll listen to Klaus another 5 minutes, and then the rest of you will be welcome in. Klaus. Yes. High risk. No.
Now it's going. I can hear that. Oh, much better. I've been cutting down trees, and I've had, that's why I put it the other way around. Well, I'm not going to comment on everything, because I won't remember everything, but I will comment a few things that I think, and I will start with the most provocative, and that is, I don't think the poverty alleviation objective in Bosnia-Herzegovina is relevant. I think it can be counterproductive to have it, because the worst case that would happen for the poor in Bosnia-Herzegovina is another war. And the best chance of avoiding another war is getting part of the EU. So that is the primary objective. The country strategies have not really focused very much on poverty in Bosnia-Herzegovina. But I know it's always coming back, and it's the embassy is talking about it. And I think it is, when you travel around, you don't see poor people. I'm sure there are, but you don't see them. I also want to agree with Henrik in the sense that I did mention that there is a batch of fairly new projects, very different from the agriculture and very much in line of what you're talking about, potentially high growth, employing young people, and that is on IT and challenge funds and incubators, etc. But these are not very much part of the report because they are it's difficult to draw the results yet because they're fairly young. One interesting thing is that there was a project supporting an incubator, an IT incubator in Sarajevo, the hub från 87, I think it's called, and that was considered by the evaluator of it as a failure because it was partly not following the rules how to spend the money, and they had promised so many companies that survive, and there were only half of them or none or a few that. So it was written off as a failure or a part failure, and I visited this project, and it was flourishing. It was doing very well. The hub 487, and the company was growing, and they were coming more and more, and the young people in Sarajevo said this is a great project. Partly maybe SIDA contributed to a great project because they did seed funding at that time. So it's very true. You know that one. Yeah, I think those the things I really want to comment on my 4 minutes, or what it could be.
Fine, thank you very much. Well, let's open the floor and see what other questions you might have here, and you're welcome with any type of question. Could be both methodological issues, or is that the first question, or? It's a comment. It's a response to Henrik. Okay. Yes, sure.
Henrik, you were worried that we said that it was good value of the support to business environment reform, in spite of the fact that Bosnia is lagging the other countries. Actually, that is the only area in this whole number of projects where there has been made use of a formal model or quantify the benefits, so-called compliance cost for companies, measuring the time required to ask for permits and so on and so on. And that actually showed that one of those projects had quite good value for money. You could discuss these models, but it's interesting. And I would say also that considering the tremendous uphill battle it is to carry out business environment reform, they have produced quite good.
Thank you. Yes, we have one question here.
Yeah, Pelle is my name. I worked in Bosnia 2011 to 14. And the first one is a comment on the agriculture focus, which I fully agree to your conclusions. Unfortunately, I think this observation goes for the entire development cooperation, that actually is misled by trying to see where the poor people are employed and therefore go into the wrong sectors. It's not only in Bosnia where agriculture is shrinking, is the lowest productive sector, and it should trigger a discussion in our analysis on where we put our funding for employment and for economic growth. Then two more critical things. It's about, I think it's a lost opportunity that Sweden has not been more, we have a huge clout in Bosnia due to the refugees in Sweden. And we have not really used that position, for instance, for being more active, using the diaspora, using the political dialogue more aggressively for changes in all sectors, including this one. And the last one is, the fact that the entire, this is about the economic sector, but the public sector is enormous, and it's very predatory in its structure, the politicians and so forth, and that hampers the development. So maybe more could have been said about changing this business climate from where you changed both from a planned economy to market economy at the same time as the war broke out, and that has really put a dead hand over the entire development in the economic sector.
Thank you. Would you like to respond to some of those issues about the role of the diaspora in cooperation, or any of the other points?
I can just comment on diaspora. I totally agree. We should keep on trying, because we have tried a couple of times. It's been difficult to get, for example, business ventures going from diaspora here back to Bosnia. We have a couple of good examples now, and that's thanks to the Challenge Fund we mentioned also, because they've been reaching out in the huge Bosnian diaspora community here. But I think we need to do more, definitely. Thank you.
Maybe, maybe this one. Maybe I can, about your comment, Claes, on us being, I mean, poverty is not the thing, as you said. And I would say, and you contrasted that by saying it should be EU, like getting closer to the EU membership, and I guess everything that comes with that. But I really don't see the sort of contradiction in that sense, because for us, EU approximation and in some distant future accession for Bosnia-Herzegovina is of course important for the EU, I would argue, but it is so very important for the citizens of Bosnia-Herzegovina in terms of all the reforms and the development and the possibilities for men and women, independently if they're living in situations of poverty or if they are living in better situations. So I would say for us, the EU accession and the reforms it brings is the vehicle that we see to work with people living in poverty and in general development. It's also so that the EU itself puts a lot of emphasis on the inclusive development and of including sectors that are actually not included in this. So, but I guess this sort of message goes perhaps more to a political level. We do have a task of working with the most needy, but we should of course be smart in that. So working with segments that are not so poor would, I guess you argue, bring benefits for also the poorest in the long run. So it's sort of a political issue that has to be decided in that sense, I would say.
Brief comment, yes?
Well, an interesting case was that we in the Republika Srpska, we met a number of small, medium-type enterprises that were doing very well in various types of industries, exporting to the EU and basically good companies, good SMEs. And when we talked to these guys and said, how was it when you, and they were all have a background in Bosnian or Yugoslavian industries, and Yugoslavia focused on industries in Bosnia-Herzegovina because of they made a smarter decision. They realized there are better opportunities for agriculture in Serbia, in the other countries, and not in the mountainous country of Bosnia-Herzegovina. They said, well, we all worked in these industries, and we tried hard after the war when we came back or when we were there trying to get going with our industries. And I said, did you get support? No, we didn't get support anywhere. No one provided us with support. And then you think there's a trade-off, there's a lost opportunity. Rather than pouring money into agriculture, not only the first couple of years, but eventually shifting over to where the country had its strengths, its compared advantage, where they had good entrepreneurs with a lot of technical skills, would have, in my mind, done more for poverty in the country and then pouring into agriculture. That's my point. And I agree with you, the EU thing. It's not a contradiction.
Thanks. We have a question way down there. By the way, I would introduce you if I could, but most of the time I can't. So please just say who you are and where you come from.
Hello, I'm Susanna Alfors from Sida. Thank you. I was just wondering, it's very interesting to hear this is an evaluation of the economic development, but I was curious to hear, like, if you, because I'm wondering what about the other sectors like the environment support and gender equality? Did you sort of get to look at projects involving those targets at all and can say something about whether that is a failure or a success, or did you not look at projects within that sector at all? And I guess that question is to Claes.
Well, given the number of projects, etc., I think we are happy that we didn't try to capture more, and it's a problem when you select 50 specific projects in not one sector but a number of sectors, that you wish you could say more of the other sectors, because there are good projects, particularly in public sector reform in the country. So the short answer to your question is no, we did not.
And the long answer? No.
That was the one you got before.
We'll take the next question. Yes. You.
Hi, my name is Ristin Thomasson. I work for the organization Kvinna till Kvinna. And previously I used to work in Bosnia-Herzegovina for 12 years between year 2001 and 2013. Linked to the previous question, I haven't read the report, but just going through it a little bit, it seemed not to be any gender disaggregated data of the sectors that you studied. So it would be interesting to hear something about that. And I also note that the colleagues from SIDA didn't comment on that. Also linked to that, Henrik mentioned that you work with local councils and regional councils. And just as a word of caution, representation in those councils tend to be mainly male, like 90% male. So it's just important, just because you work with them, you may not reach a good representation of the population. And the final comment is that I see a lot of poor people in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Somebody said that you don't see poor people. So yeah, I would be grateful to hear some comments on that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Our assessment had to be based almost entirely on existing documentation, on reviews, evaluations, final reports, and what have you, on these projects. And the comments on gender in those were generally that not much had been achieved. They were part of the design, but the implementation of it was poor. I think that was a fairly general conclusion. And there was a particular study on gender in Bosnia-Herzegovina which came to more or less the same conclusion. So that is the basis of our conclusion. It's difficult to see how you treat agriculture. There were not much focus on sectors besides agriculture that were that important to women. They could have been designed that way, but there wasn't. And the problem with agriculture is that it's not an absorber of jobs. It's reducing jobs rather. Your last point was, I don't remember.
Poverty?
Yeah, okay. Everything is relative, and I probably traveled a lot, but I'm sure. But so forget that comment. That was a stupid comment, but it's not Africa. Let's put it that way. It's a higher income, middle income country. One have to take that into account too.
Thanks, Sara and Torgny.
No, I just wanted to comment on that. I think, correct me, Klaus, but if I remember correctly, when you looked at the evaluation, you said on the whole that there was a dearth of gender disaggregated data, and also in terms of identifying who had benefited from, or who intended to be benefited, and even job creation was not included. So this is, I think, a message in terms of how we report and analyze that. Also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the labor force participation of women is very low, and so, in general, you want to help women, then I think job creation is certainly not the only aspect you have to look at. You have to look at activating them, and so that comes into how do you create growth and then help people accessing that growth, right?
Thanks. Torgny.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the comment, Kristin. It's true. I agree. It's sort of gender disaggregated data and information is not present, and Klaus gives the reason for sort of the sources not providing that. I can just say that I mean, this is highly speculative, but of course, if you had that data, you might have a slightly different indication about the effect of working in the agricultural sector. The fairly recent midterm review of the Pharma project showed good results in terms of giving income to women in rural settings. So, I mean, at least it might, to a bit, modify that issue. May I think so many of sort of Pelle's questions were sort of left hanging, or one connected, of course, to Klaus' provocative statement. But it's a very valid statement about, and you said we are misled, Pelle, by seeking out the poorest. I must be very humble and say that I need to know more, in my case, about the Bosnian context and actually see how that is done. But my thinking is that we need to have a balance. To be relevant, we also need to bring the poorest into the markets, into having good access to public service, etc. So it's not either or. I think it's both. And yes, the public sector, of course, is a challenge in the Bosnian case, because it's extremely Byzantine. Is that the term you use? Yes. India, but Byzantine, you say? Byzantine. Yes. Airport, yeah. Right. And finally, I'd just like to say, yes, I think the political dialogue needs to be sort of geared up and be more honest and aggressive, if you wish, and actually to team up with the Commission and the European Union to a larger degree. I think that is needed. Thank you.
Can I add?
Yes, sure.
It's on the same issue, and we regret that we don't have gender disaggregated data in the historic projects. Now, as you pointed out, the female labor participation is extremely low. It's only Kosovo has a lower number in that region. So we do have special attention to that one in the newer programs, very clear. Same with the youth unemployment, which is also among the highest I've ever seen all over the world. So we do try to streamline the programs to target those groups, especially women and youth, to see how, because those are just way back in the economic development. And then a comment on Pelle on the agri. Yes, I think if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, the output you can get, or the, what do you call it, the leverage on investing in agriculture and rural development can be extremely high, but it's not the case in the Western Balkans. So it's not the best one, I guess. Yeah. So that's why we're getting out of there also. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks. And then we have a question here.
Hello, I'm Lena Kovames, working with the Guarantee Unit with SIDA, and it's more just a reflection in terms when it comes to when we're talking about poverty. I myself have been working with the Eastern Balkans and Western Balkan and Eastern Europe for some 15 years at SIDA, And to my recollection, actually, the main target for all the cooperation to this region until, say, the 5-7 most recent years has not really focused on poverty. Rather, it's been the government's decision that SIDA should focus on the reform process in those countries, as opposed to SIDA's development cooperation in all other countries in Africa, Asia, etc. Yeah.
Thanks. Would any of you like to comment or respond? It's clear. Yeah.
I think it's true what Lena says. Sorry, it's true what you say. With the government that entered in 2014, there was a renewed discussion about this, and it was clarified, and it meant that we more introduced this in what we call the sort of operationalization of the strategy, when we sort of try to interpret the strategy and bring it down to programs, concrete programs. It is also very clearly spelled out in SIDA's, in the instruction to SIDA and the overall guiding sort of rules and regulations for SIDA, that we should focus on those issues, regardless if we're talking about reform cooperation or humanitarian or whatever it is.
Thanks. Well, I think I will use my powers as chair to ask a question on my own. And there's a thing that I've been wondering a little bit about in the report and also in the discussions here. And that's the concept of risk-taking, which is quite prominent, of course. But in retrospect, it might seem like investing so much money in agriculture in an area where there's not much of a commercial tradition in agriculture and poor capacities in the field, it's pretty risky. Whereas not doing it and going into another field would be less risky. So how do you as an evaluator make sense out of this thing with when is one taking a risk and when not? And what seems to be the sort of obvious low risk investment?
That was a difficult question.
I meant it.
Explain a little bit more about this agriculture because it's complex. And in the first 5-6 years after the end of the war, it was definitely justified to do agriculture for the refugees when there was nothing else. There was people couldn't, not survive. The problem was that this was dragged on. It was implemented by humanitarian international organizations, and they made it larger and larger and larger and more complex, and SIDA funded until it was heavily criticized. And then SIDA decided rather hastily to move out of that in not too well-designed exit projects. And that costed $500,000 or whatever it was. It was $500 million. It was expensive, and there was very little left on that one. But the problem was the continuing in agriculture, and I still don't really understand why. And it's of a totally different character, with food safety, vaccination, value chain, projects with different partners, etc. And that was done at a time when one should have really taken a strong look at what is working well in this country, including poverty, including female employment and whatnot. But it didn't take place. It was rather, an opportunity because USAID was going to do it. So let's join USAID because it doesn't cost much time for SIDA stuff. And that carried on, and it's still carrying on. It's still one of the main themes. And when the big USAID SIDA project Pharma was evaluated by SIDA, and they came up with, it's pretty good. And then USAID basically tried a very complex evaluation, concluded that it's no impact. There is no control. There's a control group, and it showed the same results. SIDA at that time dismissed that. They continued anyway with the second phase. And to me, it's only explained by the factor of there is not time enough to analyze. There is not time enough to look into alternatives. It's better to continue because that's probably less risky. all the results are not too great. I don't know if that gives an answer to your question or not.
It certainly does, and it's also interesting because from many points of view you could say that not analyzing, just progressing with what seems to be the easiest way ahead is pretty risky.
Yeah.
But it comes across as a risk minimizing strategy, but in fact it's not. It's very, very risky.
Yeah. Yeah.
Slippery subject. Yes.
Because it connects to, you said you had certain interest in the issue of having long-term evaluations and so I think this is one issue where you make visible, by looking over the long haul, you make visible points where you should have sort of perhaps taken a different tack or decided on changing strategies, etc. Or you should be blending in something else. So it sort of gives you a sort of an instrument to evaluate how you actually prioritize over time, instead of just looking at sort of efficiency internally within something within a more limited time frame. So I think that makes it very, very interesting. And of course the other aspect is that development does take time. So that's why we need to look over the longer period.
Any other questions around here? It's a wonderful, the afternoon, but.
One reflection of our relation to European Union and USAID. This is not an evaluation of the development cooperation of EU, but my reflection is that although it's very powerful at the political level with the accession agenda, it's very clear what kind of reforms they need to do. The process of implementing EU projects is very poor. It's very lengthy. It takes a couple of years from when they identify the problem until they come up with a project that should solve it, and then the reality has changed. So I think and then it's very difficult to collaborate with the European Union because they are very strict in their formats. So I think that's an interesting topic for next evaluation on how Sweden actually interacts with the European Union. And if you compare that to the USAID, one reason for joining them was that they were much powerful in both in capacity among staff, but also in the political dialogue in these sectors, which European Union completely lacked, I would say. So if you have any comments on these kind of, it's both the political economy, but also the way that development cooperation is being implemented.
Yes, sure.
Well, of course, Bosnia-Herzegovina is a special case because of the EU accession, and that is the powerful tool, not the development cooperation. So it's not relevant for other countries. It may be relevant for the other Balkan countries or not. But and of course, EU's strength is not the development cooperation. It's their political decision making, whether to accept a country as a candidate and a country as a etc. So it's joining that, joining the power of the EU in getting a country to be included rather than to do more projects. And maybe one way of doing it is taking the criteria, the Copenhagen criteria, which Bosnia-Herzegovina is not fulfilling, and focusing on the constraints on those, and say we are going to solve. SIDA is going to solve, constraints number one, which EU has identified. So this is in line with what the EU do. You don't have to cooperate with EU in development cooperation, but that's the idea behind this one. What I meant. I know all these problems you have with cooperating with them or working with them, by the way. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, big question there.
Well, I would just like to add something positive then, in that sense that we are doing that, I think. I mean, my name is Anna-Karin. I work for SKL International, the Swedish Association of Local Governments and Regions. And we are trying to see what benefits and what implications the accession, or, well, sooner or later, the accession process brings for the municipalities, for the local governments, because that's where a lot of this needs to happen, and it's where it's closest to the people. So I think this is something that SIDA has seen, and that is ongoing process. So just to say something positive, that some things can happen, and I think SIDA has drawn some conclusions on, I mean, this how to use the EU reform processes. So, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Anna-Karin. That was a very good comment. I just want to say, so the EU, I commented on the EU being a vehicle for change and for reform, etc. If there is an EU process, then it is a potential instrument. Problem is that during times there hasn't really been any. It's been sort of in a deadlock. Let's hope it sort of moves forward. And I do agree with working with preparing municipalities and improving their services to citizens, etc. is usually about 60-70% of the whole EU acquis, the EU sort of rules and regulations. So working on that level could bring a lot also of benefits for the economic development environment, and that is an integral and important part of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, you can.
Another positive thing that leave this with a positive feeling. SIDA is financing a fairly new project called the Small Business Act. And the purpose of that is the EU, they want Bosnia-Herzegovina to have a small business act. But the problem in Bosnia-Herzegovina is that the Republika Srpska wants one, and the Federation wants one, and probably Bruskup another one, I don't know. But SIDA is funding a project which, using the Credo methodology, working under the radar and getting this act going without the politicians even noticing it, to fulfill the Copenhagen criteria, etc. So that's positive. Was that positive enough?
We'll see. Now it's time for me to conclude, have my concluding comments. No, this has been a very rich report with many things that I could raise and that we can all take with us, both about the development in Bosnia-Herzegovina and development cooperation and governance in development cooperation. But maybe my own interests lie particularly with evaluation methodology. As we have commented on many times here, this is an evaluation with a long-term perspective, and there are very few of those. If we consider that SIDA commissions some 70 evaluations a year, and there are several we commission from EBA as well. There were 3 done by SIDA in the past of Vietnam, Laos and Sri Lanka, and we have commissioned a few 4 as well. But out of those hundreds that have been commissioned over the years, there are very few that take that long-term perspective. One of the arguments said is that it's difficult to get access to data. It's cumbersome methodologically to make sense of causal connections, and besides, who cares about history? Now, what you have proven well here is that it is possible, feasible, interesting, and potentially useful, and that's very fine. We're happy with that, and I think there are some points that particularly mention looking at, and that's this issue with path dependence. That is a very important social economic phenomena. Very important to understand what happens in the world today and how projects have impact and how organizations react. And to discover path dependence, you do need a long-term perspective. You do need to go beyond project and program cycles. You have also pointed to the importance of context, and I understand that you have spent quite a lot of time looking at context, and that is one of the things that makes the report so readable and interesting, that it is rich in contextual information. That changes the evaluation game a little bit, because it's no longer so interesting to talk about randomized controlled trials, etc., if you're going to do this kind of evaluations. That's not possible in the long run. Such evaluations do have their role to fulfill in gathering evidence, but if you take a longer term perspective, it's often not fruitful. There is no other Bosnia-Herzegovina. We had our study of Tanzania. There is no other Tanzania to compare to. So the methodological debates in evaluation do become different. It also, I assume, means that you as evaluators need to spend your time a little bit differently, spending more time in archives, doing less with interviews, etc. So there are a lot of methodological implications that are important for us in EBA to take into mind. As I mentioned, we have 4 country evaluations completed, long-term country evaluations completed now, and the 5th one coming. And our idea is at some point in time we need to assess this experience, both in terms of methodologically, how can one do this in different ways, but also in terms of usefulness and interest, to see are they really useful and what does it mean that they are useful. Because interesting is one thing, useful is perhaps another, and that needs more analysis. Now, that being said about the evaluation, one of the things that we talked about was risk-taking, and that leads me to the next EBA seminar, which will be about a report on media and development cooperation and our organization, Sida, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and how a media logic has an impact on risk-taking in organizations. That seminar will be, is the date set yet for that?
Most likely 24th of May.
24th, most likely. So with some risk, we say 24th of May. But, thanks, that's very good. Fine, and then you will have seen that there is a copy of Biståndsanalys on your chairs. That's our annual report to the government. Aid policy review, I think would be the English title of it. It's where we sum up a number of different evaluations that we have commissioned over the year, also going back a little bit to those that we have had over previous years, but reflect on the same topics. Please take those with you, study them, comment on them, Twitter about them or whatever. So thank you very much for today and for spending the afternoon here. I mean, it's a competitive environment out there, so thanks for being here. And you can stay a little bit longer and have coffee with us, tea or so out there. Thank you very much.